You are listening to American Nightmare Radio. In 1971, a novel titled The Exorcist terrified readers across the world. 2 years later, the film adaptation would become one of the most disturbing movies ever released, embedding the idea of demonic possession into modern horror culture. What many people don't realize is that the story did not originate entirely from fiction. Hidden behind the terrifying narrative was a real case. A case involving a teenage boy, a series of violent disturbances, and one of the most controversial religious interventions ever documented in the United States. The boy was never publicly identified. Even today, his real name remains protected. But in historical records, he is often referred to as Roland Doe or Robbie Mannheim. The events began in 1949 in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Cottage City, Maryland. At the time, the boy was said to be around 13 years old. By most accounts, he lived a fairly ordinary life. His family described him as quiet, intelligent, and somewhat introverted. He spent much of his time alone, often reading or working on small hobbies around the house. But there was one person he was particularly close to: his aunt. She was described as an eccentric woman with an interest in spiritualism and the supernatural. Family members later recalled that she introduced the boy to something that had become popular in American households during the early 20th century: a Ouija board. According to later testimony, the boy and his aunt would occasionally sit together experimenting with the board, asking questions, waiting for the planchette to move, hoping for responses from whatever might exist beyond the visible world. For them, it was little more than a curiosity, a game. But shortly after his aunt died unexpectedly in early 1949, strange things reportedly began happening inside the house. At first, the disturbances were subtle. Family members described hearing scratching sounds coming from the walls late at night, footsteps in empty rooms, furniture shifting slightly across the floor. The boy's parents initially dismissed the noises as rodents or problems within the house itself. But the activity continued. Soon, objects inside the boy's bedroom reportedly began moving on their own. A chair sliding several inches across the floor, a blanket pulling itself free from the bed, and on multiple occasions, witnesses claimed to hear tapping sounds coming from the mattress beneath the boy while he slept. Concerned and increasingly frightened, the family sought help from their church. At first, the situation was treated cautiously. The possibility of stress, grief, or psychological distress was considered. But as the disturbances continued to escalate, the events surrounding the boy would begin attracting the attention of ministers, doctors, and eventually, Catholic priests. What started as unexplained noises inside a quiet Maryland home was slowly becoming something far more unsettling. And within weeks, the case would spread far beyond the family itself. If you're enjoying our broadcast this evening, consider subscribing to American Nightmare. We have many more dreadful reports to bring you. And now, back to our broadcast. As the disturbances inside the Mannheim home continued, the family began seeking outside help. At first, They contacted a Lutheran minister named Reverend Luther Schultz, who agreed to visit the house and observe what was happening. Schultz later reported witnessing several unusual events during his time there. According to his account, chairs moved across the floor without explanation. A heavy armchair reportedly slid several inches while no one was touching it. And during one visit, the minister claimed he saw the boy's bed violently shaking while the boy lay on top of it. These observations alarmed the minister enough that he began documenting the events. He also consulted with physicians and mental health professionals to determine whether the boy might be suffering from psychological distress. Doctors examined him. Psychiatrists interviewed him. But according to the records that survive, no clear explanation was found. The boy reportedly displayed no signs of severe mental illness, and medical professionals could not determine a reason for the disturbances described by the family. As the weeks passed, the phenomena reportedly became more aggressive. Witnesses claimed that scratches began appearing on the boy's skin. At times, letters or words seemed to form across his chest and arms. One of the most frequently mentioned markings was a single word, Lewis. At the time, no one understood what the word might mean, but it would soon become important. Meanwhile, the boy's behavior reportedly began to change. Family members described episodes where he would suddenly become violent or unresponsive. At other times, he appeared calm and normal. The combination of physical disturbances, unexplained markings, and behavioral changes led the family to pursue a different course of action. They contacted a Catholic priest. The case was eventually brought to the attention of Father William Bowdern, a Jesuit priest in St. Louis, Missouri. Bowdern approached the case cautiously. He knew the Catholic Church historically required extensive investigation before authorizing an exorcism. Mental illness, fraud, and environmental explanations all had to be ruled out. But after reviewing the accounts and consulting with others involved in the investigation, Bowdern agreed to observe the boy personally. Soon after, the family traveled to St. Louis, and the location referenced by the mysterious word appearing on the boy's skin would become the center of what many consider the most famous American exorcism case ever recorded. In March of 1949, the boy arrived in St. Louis. The initial examinations took place at Alexian Brothers Hospital, where several priests and medical staff agreed to monitor the situation. Among them were Father William Bowdern, Father Walter Halloran, and Father Raymond Bishop, who began carefully documenting what they witnessed during the following weeks. According to Father Bishop's diary, one of the primary surviving sources from the case, the boy's condition became increasingly volatile. Episodes were described in which the bed shook violently. Objects in the room moved without clear explanation. And during several rituals, witnesses reported hearing the boy speak in voices that did not appear to be his own. The priests began performing the Roman ritual, the formal exorcism prayers used by the Catholic Church. These prayers were conducted repeatedly over a period of weeks, often late at night, sometimes lasting for hours. According to the records, the boy resisted violently during several of these sessions. At one point, Father Halloran reportedly suffered a deep scratch on his arm after the boy broke free from restraints. Yet, despite the chaos described in the room, the priests continued. They believed they were confronting something spiritual, something that could not be explained through normal medical understanding. Then came the final night. According to Father Bowden's account, the boy suddenly became calm during one of the rituals. After days of violent resistance, he reportedly sat upright in the bed and spoke clearly. He claimed to see a vision of Saint Michael the Archangel. Moments later, he shouted a final word. "He's gone." After that moment, the disturbances reportedly stopped. The boy returned to normal behavior almost immediately. Within days, he was discharged. The family left St. Louis, and the boy's identity was sealed to protect his privacy. Over time, the case faded from public attention. But years later, writer William Peter Blatty learned about the story through newspaper reports and interviews with clergy involved in the investigation. Those events would eventually inspire the novel, The Exorcist. To this day, the Roland Doe case remains one of the most debated paranormal events in American history. Some believe the boy suffered from psychological illness. Others believe witnesses misinterpreted natural events. And some remain convinced that what occurred in that hospital room in 1949 was something far more difficult to explain. In the years following the events in St. Louis, the identity of the boy involved in the case was deliberately concealed. Church officials believed that revealing his name would only bring unwanted attention and potentially damage the rest of his life. So the boy, who became known publicly as Roland Doe or Robbie Mannheim, simply disappeared from the historical record. The priests who participated in the exorcism rarely spoke about the case again. Father William Bowden returned to his duties as a Jesuit priest, declining most requests from journalists who wanted to hear the full story. Father Walter Halloran, who had assisted during the rituals, would occasionally confirm that the events had occurred, but he was careful about describing what he had personally witnessed. And Father Raymond Bishop's diary, one of the most important records of the case, remained largely private for many years. Because of this secrecy, the case quickly became surrounded by speculation. Some researchers believe the disturbances may have been caused by psychological trauma. Others have suggested that the boy may have intentionally created some of the events himself. But critics of those explanations often point to one fact. Multiple adults were present during many of the incidents described in the diaries. Priests, medical staff, family members, all of them witnessing things they struggled to explain. Over time, fragments of information about the boy's later life began to emerge. Some investigators believe they eventually identified him. According to these reports, the boy grew up, attended college, and went on to work as a NASA engineer. If those claims are correct, it would suggest that whatever happened during those weeks in 1949 did not follow him throughout the rest of his life. He lived quietly, built a career, started a family, and never publicly spoke about the events that made him famous under a false name. Yet the mystery of what truly happened in that hospital room remains unresolved. Was it a case of psychological distress that spiraled into religious interpretation? Was it a series of misunderstood physical events amplified by fear? Or was it something far more difficult to explain? Even the priests involved did not fully agree on the answer. What remains certain is that the Roland Doe case became one of the most influential paranormal stories ever recorded. Because decades later, a writer named William Peter Blatty would encounter newspaper reports about the strange exorcism that had taken place in St. Louis. Those articles would stay with him. Years later, they would inspire the novel The Exorcist, which would transform a little-known religious case into one of the most famous horror stories ever told. But behind the fictional characters and terrifying scenes, the real story remains quieter. A frightened family, a teenage boy, and a group of priests who believed they were confronting something beyond human understanding. More than 70 years later, the debate still continues, and the truth behind the Robbie Mannheim exorcism may never be fully known. You've been listening to American Nightmare Radio, where some stories refuse to stay buried.